Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've got a very goodly number of people who've joined tonight, and I'm sure there'll be one or two more coming in. I'd like to say a warm welcome to Tim Wigmore. Tim has written a really interesting book, which I expect a number of you have either looked at or might want to buy, but there it is. I don't know whether you can see that properly, but it's Test Cricket, a History. It's the first book that Tim has written on his own. I'll just come on and talk a little bit about his background in a moment, but just as sort of matters of practicality, if you could all remain on mute through the meeting, and as and when you have questions, just please put them on the chat because we can then bring them into the conversation either as they appear or if that works or towards the end of the meeting. So I'm going to talk to Tim now and get him to talk about this book, which is a real masterpiece and pièce de résistance, I think it's fair to say. But just on Tim's background, he's the staff writer for the Daily Telegraph on cricket. He's written a number of very interesting books or co-authored a number of very interesting books. The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, Cricket 2.0, Inside the T20 Revolution. He's written a book about Second 11, cricket in its outposts, White Hot, the inside story of England's cricket's double winning world champions, and then the Crickonomics book, which was shortlisted for the Cricket Society MCC Book of the Year a couple of years ago. So I think it's probably fair to say, Tim, that you're a very prolific writer. So this is your the first book you've written on your own. When you're dealing with a subject that covers 150 plus years of history, how on earth do you start?
Yeah, firstly, hi everyone, and thanks Peter for that kind of introduction. Yeah, so I suppose the kind of genesis of the book was quite simple. In a way, like all my books, which is that it was the book I wanted to read, but I couldn't find the book I was wanting to read, so I thought I needed to try and write it myself. So Simon Wilde wrote a very good history of the England Test team in 2018. I remember talking to him afterwards and sort of like, would you think about doing this for, global Test cricket? And he said you have to be mad to do that. And I thought, oh, maybe I am mad. And the idea really is to tell this, and there's been quite a lot of sort of statsy books, but there hasn't been a narrative history based on story and personalities and tracing the players, the characters, the politics that have shaped the game over its 150 years, and getting the kind of interconnections between all the countries. So that was the real ambition in the book, and it was a bigger undertaking than I'd realized. It took me 5 years from start to end. I think I read over 300 books, bibliography. I also talked to over 40 players, some of the best players of all time. From Michael Holding, Sachin Tendulkar, Dale Steyn, so many great players, and I was really amazed how many talked to me in the end, and that was really important because it hopefully it's got a fresher, so it's not obviously I've read a huge amount, and it's not just reliant on that, it's reliant on primary sources as well, and I've tried to get a sense of evolution over time, and actually by zooming out you can get sometimes you get more perspective on individual countries as well because you can get a sense of something's happening here, but it's not happening there, and so on. So yeah, certainly a labor of love, but a huge thrill to do, and I learned so much doing it. And obviously, there's plenty of great players and matches I haven't covered, but I've gone for the story approach, which means to an extent I've probably covered slightly fewer, but in more detail. So it's very much a book that hopefully is, I think, best read from cover to cover. Although obviously you can dip into it, but and it picks up players and teams at critical moments in their stories. It doesn't sort of go decade by decade, but it tries to get a sense of change and evolution, and goes big on those moments that really do change the sport.
So, how do you remain focused on delivering something over 5 years, and how did your attitude to the book and Test cricket change over that period? It's a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is a long time, and I mean, I got an extension during the book, which was certainly one of the best things I did because it means, however good or bad the book is, I feel it is the best book that I could do, which was obviously really important. You don't get a sort of a second shot at a project kind of as big as this. Um, I mean, one of the biggest takeaways, and it's kind of quite heartening in a way is how negative people have been about Test cricket throughout its history. So the first reference I could find is basically the game's gone. It's not as good as it used to be. The players all play for money, not the badge on the shirt. It was 1884, and in the golden age, pre World War One, you have all these fears about not enough people are actually going and everything. And then you have when World Series cricket, you have so in the 1950s, everyone's calling for brighter cricket when it is a very drab decade, and World Series cricket comes in 77, and people think this will be the end because even when you have the reincorporation of the pack of players afterwards, there's a sense that they'll just play white ball cricket from now on. So, and then T20 and everything. So you have all these moments when of kind of crisis or what's in crisis, and actually Test cricket does endure. And I think the other thing is Test cricket is as soon as this very very conservative sport, but actually it adapts. It's adapted far more than people think. You just kind of zoom out. You've gone from two nations to 12. You've had the introduction of helmets. Actually, from a sporting sense, one of the biggest ones. You've had pitches, uncovered to covered. You have day night matches. You have the World Test Championship. Different rules on fast bowling. Even number of balls per over. Anything between 4 and 8. Of course, also used to have a mixture of 3-day tests and timeless tests. You didn't, 5-day tests were actually, I think only been about 10 5-day tests before World War II. So actually, a lot of the things that we think of as kind of immutable in Test cricket were always changing, and this adaptability is part of its, why it's endured and survived. So I think those two strands actually, the kind of underrated way in which Test cricket has constantly evolved, and also the sense that this thing is always under threat. Those are the two of the common themes throughout history. And I suppose in terms of what that makes me think now, well, I guess the fact that these concerns are so perennial about Test cricket, that actually does make me more optimistic in a way, because these are the kind of exact problems, of course, that challenges, they are unique today, but the sense of having problems and of being under threat from different formats or even or even club cricket is not new. Remember before World War II, you would get a series of leading players from countries like West Indies and New Zealand who they would be unavailable because for test matches because of playing in Lancashire leagues, right? So club country, it's not a new problem. Just the specifics of it today, of course, are different, but the nature, the sense that players can earn more from club cricket than they can from international is not new. So yeah, these issues that they come around, and I suppose the flip side of that, of course, is this leads me to this eternal frustration that you do realize that Test cricket has been administered in such a really terrible way throughout its history, in such a myopic way, with very much interest of 2 or 3 countries at one time governing everything else. So there have been a series of missed opportunities as well. I talk about in the book. For me, the big sliding doors moment is back in 1909 when the first ICC is formed, and you have to be a member of the British Empire to be part of that, and that excludes Argentina and USA, which are two of the 5 or 6 strongest countries in the world at that time. And you have those two countries, and you have the whole map of Test cricket is different, and then that probably brings in other countries as well subsequently. So I think the frustration is that administrators have been so focused on kind of on exclusion rather than openness, and then the contrast with other sports is pretty notable, and it's pretty damning.
Yes, who knows what could have happened if the USA and Argentina hadn't been excluded back in 1909. Just going back a little bit further, I got the sense that the definition of a test match was rather loose, and that there's some degree of debate about whether 1877 was really the first one.
Yeah, so this is the other, amazing thing, because we talk about the sanctity of statistics, the sanctity of test states, and of course, this has been for a lot of test history, it's been a basis for negotiation, really. So the idea of a test match is basically it originates as a marketing tool because it's a way to pump up a particular tool. And what are these tools? Well, these tools they're for profit, privately run tours. In which basically a small select number of English or Australian players go to the other country and they play a series of matches. And 1877, so the first test match at Melbourne then, so England in that tour had picked 12 players for a 6-month tour. And by the time they get to Melbourne, they've only got 11 because one of those players, Ted Pooley, he's in prison in New Zealand. So you have a situation there where England have only 11 players there. And so then in the 1890s, you get an Australian journalist who kind of retrospectively decides which matches constitute test matches, and it's slightly idiosyncratic, his definition. Because before, you'd get you'd basically have often you get parallel tours by English teams to Australia at the same time, and you might have some of the best players here, some of the best ones there, and then some of them actually wouldn't bother going at all because they weren't being paid enough. So with WG Grace, who of course is the great icon of his day. Well, he only plays two of the first 13 Test matches, but he wouldn't have known at the time what actually were Test matches and what weren't. So I do find it kind of funny when people say, "Oh, so and so is ruining Test match stats." Well, actually look at the history. It's amazing actually how rare Tests have genuinely been fought between 11 best players from both countries because there's been politics getting in the way, there's been selection, and of course there's been, England in 1930 played two tests at the same time, and West Indies in New Zealand. So obviously that literally is impossible for them both to have been the best teams. And it's amazing how how selection from boards stopped the best teams being picked. So I think West Indies in their first home test series 1930 against England, four test matches, they have picked 28 different players because the host country in every case they wanted to pick a lot of their own players. So again, it's a sort of rotary. It's not a test sort of it's not a test team or a test squad in the way we think of it today, and that's actually is surprisingly recent in its history when that's been the case. You also look at England and who they're picking as captain. Well, so England obviously with amateur captains until 1952 when Len Hutton becomes the first professional captain since the 1880s. Well, amateur captains meant that England were picking, a weakened team on purpose. And there's some incredible examples. I think 1951 too. So this wins before England go to India. Nigel Howard is picked as captain, and his first last career he doesn't bowl, and his first last career his average is 23, and he's picked to be captain and makes his debut as captain. He averages 17 and four tests, and then his drop. But it's amazing. And I do have one of my theories for why Australia are so much better than the kind of rest on average is they are better than most other countries at being nearer to their actual full strength in terms of who they're picking.
Yes, they've had a reputation, haven't they, over the years for saying we get our best 11 players out, then we'll choose the captain. You're no doubt able to be far more accurate in your assessment than me. But going back to 1909 and the creation of the ICC, the Imperial Cricket Conference, USA and Argentina excluded. Is that really a manoeuvre by the Great Britain and the MCC in combination?
Well, so the key driving force in that actually is Abe Bailey, who's an Anglo-South African mining magnate, basically, and he views cricket as a way to cement ties between South Africa and Britain and to a lesser extent Australia. And he's a kind of arch establishment figure. One of his daughters marries one of Churchill's sons. So he's an arch establishment figure, and he sees cricket, Test cricket, as a way to make that relationship deeper. And he, yeah, and then the idea of this involving, other countries from outside the empire is anathema to him basically, and he's the driving force. And he then instigates the Tri Series in 1912 as
Mm.
well. And so yeah, and so you have this odd situation where a team who are probably not maybe the fourth, not necessarily in the top three teams in the world at the time, was ended up running in a way that how the game was formed because England and Australia were kind of um, fairly lackadaisical in their approach, and it needed someone who really kind of cared about the direction of travel to take it in that way. And then you have and that is the sort of start of how you have this obsession with test status and everything, and you have the idea that countries can't be included for various reasons, and it sort of sets Test cricket up as being a game which is basically not open to everybody, and you do get countries who kind of the penny drops, right? So Argentina have a strong team. They beat several, MCC sides who have, five or six test players. I said that they are probably of similar standards to South Africa at various periods, for example, but they are, they're just neglected, and then eventually the game withers and dies. And that, yeah, USA, you have similar actually, where they go on tour to England several times, very competitive. They beat Australia and Philadelphia as well. Philadelphia produces the bulk of their players. They have Barty King, who's seen as one of the best pace bowlers in the world, early 1900s. But yeah, by excluding these countries, it sets the game on a more insular path, really.
Yes, uh, it's taken a while for its influence to spread. I think it's probably fair to say, hasn't it? But if you were looking at the period between, say, 1909 and 1977, when the Packer crisis occurred, what were the sort of big moments in that sort of 65-year period? I mean, I could name plenty of them, but I was interested in your sort of take on that.
Wow, it's a
Yeah, it
a big
is.
chunk. So, I mean, one of the reoccurring themes which I talk about in the book is that whenever you have great leaps forward in fast bowling, this basically does two things. A, it wins a lot of matches, and B, it causes lots of kind of controversy. We see that's a repeated theme in this era. So you see in 1920, 21, Australia, they have two out and out quicks for the first real time, and they thrash England, and it called it's a big deal in terms of it. You get people comparing. You get all these players that hit. You have Jack McGregor and Ted McDonald, and they are a really fearsome pair. You obviously then had Bodyline in 1930s, 32-3. Although Bodyline is kind of a response to an age of industrial run scoring. So you have 20s and 30s is the all is the peak era really for batting in Test cricket, because the pitches get very, very flat. So actually, the roller, the improvement in pitches is a really big factor after World War II. You also have matches getting longer in England, so that encourages players to play to bat for longer. But yeah, so you have the bowline is a big impact, and I suppose it subsequently eventually leads to changes in the law, but that takes a long time. I mean, that's in the 50s, so it's really a gentleman's agreement initially. You obviously in the 50s is when the 50s I think is odd because it's kind of it's a very important decade, but also a very boring one. So it's a very boring one because fewer runs are scored per over than any other decade before us in. So it's a drab era of Test cricket, lots and lots of duels. But this is the era when Test cricket actually starts to become a multi-nation game, and genuinely, and by that I mean, so until 1950, three-quarters of all Test matches had involved England as one of the two teams competing. So Test cricket is really a series of kind of bilateral engagements with England in the middle, and everyone kind of filtering around. So the 50s is when you begin to get these, where Sydney's emerge. You obviously have Pakistan, or then Pakistan are, they play from 1952 after 5 years after partition. You think you have rivalries like India, Pakistan, West Indies, Australia, so which don't involve England, and that's important. So the game is beginning to expand, but the actual cricket is often quite drab. And I suppose the early 70s is a unique. I think batting in the early 70s is probably as hard as it's ever got, because that is the era where you have an explosion in fast bowling at just the time before helmets were introduced. And of course, helmets are kind of probably going to come anyway, but the introduction of helmets is accelerated because of all the fast bowlers, which then leads to when World Series cricket comes in 77, with Kerry Packer, who runs it, he's adamant that players should wear helmets because he's aware, because the whole spectacle, right, is predicated on Packer's idea that cricket is at its most compelling on TV when it's a gladiatorial aspect, and the gladiatorial aspect is really a very, very fast bowler bowling to a batsman, and that means you have this concentration of fast bowling, you have fast wickets, and batsmen are terrified of being hit. I talked with Ian Chappell, who is, as kind of frank as you would expect, and as he recorded a great exchange he had with Packer, which is in World Series cricket, which is basically Packer saying, you've got to wear a helmet, mate. And Chappell's like, I'm not wearing a helmet. And Packer basically says, if you're hit and you're laying in loads of pain, and I really couldn't care less. I couldn't care less if you're hit on the head. But what I will not have is me be paying your salary to lie in a hospital bed for 3 months after you've been hit. So you've got to wear a helmet. And Chappell eventually kind of agrees. So that is, and I suppose that links to, I suppose the end of this period, talking about the end of '70s, which West Indies emerging as a super team. Although the only thing about that, and it is amazing, is I think sometimes people forget how good West Indies actually were at periods in the 50s and 60s as well. So early mid 60s, they were probably their number one team in the world already. So Sometimes actually, I actually think I think that West Indies post World War II team is a bit kind of forgotten because the narrative is so much around what happens from 76 onwards. But actually, you remember they're a very, very good team and outstanding team in the sixties, obviously with Gary Sobers, who arguably is still the best Test cricketer of all time.
Yes, they certainly were a good side. For people of my age, that was certainly the case. Um, what was interesting to me about some of these crises, if you take Bodyline, if you took the end of the 50s, early 60s chucking scandal and Packer, was how the establishment always closed ranks. You know, they made Harold Larwood a scapegoat. They made George Griffin, I think, and one or two others in the chucking scandal. And then, in the Packer scandal, they tried to ban people from playing county cricket, didn't they?
This is a recurring theme, to be honest, that these rules, the establishment, they are rules that suit the establishment when it wants to, and then ignore when it doesn't. And of course, this links to, the Basil D'Oliveira affair in South Africa, and so one of the kind of incredible ironies is we talked about when the ICC is formed in 1909, you have to be a member of the British Empire to be part of that, and that is rules that South Africa actually pushed. So South Africa are the instigators of this rule. And in 1960, of course, South Africa are kicked out of the Commonwealth because of apartheid. So by the own rules that they helped create, they should have been ineligible to play Test cricket. But actually, what happens is Australia, England, and New Zealand, they just ignore these rules for another decade and carry on playing against South Africa. And then, of course, we have the Basil D'Oliveira affair. So, D'Oliveira's 158, you'd have to put up there was one of the most significant innings in Test history. But it is, yeah, it's incredible. You have there is a sense of, different rules for different people. And I suppose, the MCC is a very conservative organization for much of its history. It's gone through an amazing change really the last 15, 20 years or so. But yeah, you see that with actually South Africa is one. With a sense actually when West Indies are dominant team in the 80s, there's all these kind of plans to try and curb bounces and so on. And there's a sense that there's a someone's found a method and we're not too comfortable with that for being successful. So yeah, there is this tension that does run through the history of Test cricket for sure, and it's and of course, all of this partly explains why, really, for every country, for much history of Test cricket, it is beating and is kind of the thing that the driving force. And in most countries' history, actually, if you were to identify the 5 or 10 most important tests or memorable tests on a kind of wider basis, not just a sporting basis, those early victories, the big victories over England, would be such a huge, huge, huge deal.
Yes, and of course, when Packer, the reaction of the players was largely to join Kerry Packer because they'd been so poorly paid over the years. I particularly like your anecdote about India beating New Zealand in 4 days, and
Yeah.
then because the game didn't last for 5 days, their match fee was docked by 20%. That might be an extreme example, but
Yeah,
people.
that was an incredible story, and it was 50 rupees if in 5 days, which is not very much at all. That's from the 60s. So it's remarkable, actually. And
And
actually feeds to the theme of the book, which is well, not theme of the not central theme, but one of the my big takeaways is amazing. It's incredible, really, how bad India were for so long. So till 2001, India lose virtually two tests for every one that they win in test history. And of course the underinvestment is a big part of that, and India really not maximizing their talent pool at all, and that's been a big shift. But it is interesting because we look at now we have the big three and we're going to have them forever. And there are, I guess the difference now is this big economic forces, but it's also worth noting that what we thought was the inevitable kind of order of things has changed over time. So the original big three was South Africa, England, Australia. You then obviously have West Indies being a huge, huge force, and it's obviously being so good on the pitch leads them to their significance off it. And then of course you have India, which is a combination of both. So it is different, but the big three hasn't been the big three forever. Although it is fun, England, and Australia have always found a way to kind of adapt to whoever else is in that group.
yes, the rise of India is a fascinating thing because when I was growing up in the 60s, England would routinely beat India, and it was expected that that would happen. And I guess the turning point, even though India did manage to win in 71, I think we generally still felt that we would beat them every time they came back. And Gavaskar's 221 at the
Yeah.
Oval in 79, I think, was a big turning point. But really, until Kapil Dev came on the scene, we always assumed that no one in India could bowl more than 70 miles an hour. And taking it along further, you also mentioned that Sachin Tendulkar managed one win in 44 away games, I think.
And it's yeah, one win his
It
first 44 away
Yeah,
games. Yeah,
20, 25 to 30 years later. So
incredible. Yeah.
their rise, the inextricable rise now is quite extraordinary when you consider that there's a long period where they simply, as you suggested, didn't harness their resources, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is remarkable how bad they were for so long, and I think that feeds into a central maybe it's the same of the obvious, but it's having research history of Test cricket. It's very clear to me now that the single biggest determinant in what wins you Test matches is the quality of fast bowling. That is the single most important thing, and that is basically true throughout history. And of course, with we talk about now of Pataudi and the spinning quartet, and that is seen as such a kind of romantic thing that you have all these spinners and stuff. But I kind of went through what he wrote at the time and what he wrote in his book, and this is really a defense. It's kind of been misremembered as a kind of an idealist approach. It's sort of a defensive strategy in that he's saying at the time, India will never be a test force until we have really good fast bowlers, but we don't have any, so I'm going to pick my four best bowlers who are all spinners. But he's very aware that you need fast bowlers. So he doesn't have this, it's not a kind of ideological attachment to the idea of spin. It's pragmatic, weirdly. And it's almost a shrug and shoulders of we don't, it's a kind of shrug of despair in some ways. But he's very aware. So, he's aware where at the time. And actually, only later when you have, India's talent pool increasing is a huge factor, and one of the central things as well as in terms of how you produce a good test team. Well, you need a wide pool of players more to produce bowlers than you do to produce batters. So basically, more people, some of us on this call, probably not me, but more people have the capacity to be good professional, even test batters than they do than bowlers, because bowling relies basically more on talent, more on genes, and batting relies more on upbringing, opportunity to face enough balls and so on. Which is why, actually, if you have relatively small numbers playing, but very good pitchers and so on, you can produce decent batters, but you can't. But for fast bowlers, you need more people and giving that opportunity. And that's something that so India, it kind of helps to explain maybe why India's batters tended to be, because they had relatively small number of kind of elite schools and elite cities that were producing pretty good test batters, but to produce bowlers they just didn't have the wider access to the game really.
No, how interesting it all is. I picked out that yeah, at one point the Indian Cricket Board were running a deficit of $150,000, and that wasn't very long ago. And now their turnover is something like $2.25 billion
Yeah.
a year. A
So
year.
until 1993, they would pay Doordarshan, the state broadcasters, to televise games. They would lose money from matches being televised, and now, of course, they make so much money from it. So yeah, it's remarkable how some of these things we just think of as inevitable now, how comparatively recent they are, and that was one of the kind of joys of to kind of zoom out this approach and see when things are actually changing. And you have, I suppose, moments like Kolkata 2001, which is when India overcome a deficit of 274 to beat Australia. And that is when the kind of on-field and off-field is kind of coming together, and that is the real marks the rise. And yeah, talking to Rao Dravid about that game was amazing in terms of the sense of what an incredible thing it was, and the fact that him and Laxman, his old mates from from their teenage years playing, they batted all day together, and they could just. And Dravid was saying how kind of shattered he was, and he kept having someone come out with a cold towel to warm down. He kept thinking, however tired I am, the Aussies will be even more tired, and just to have that incredible kind of transcendental experience. And then they went on a drip after the day, and then have a great victory the following day. And that is one of those moments which you can kind of they're not always this neat, but with Indian cricket you definitely can say there's a before and after Kolkata 2001. So that is one of those incredibly important test matches.
So, what you talk a bit about the World Test Championship, and yeah, I rather got the impression over the years that England seem a little bit indifferent to it, partly because they
Yes.
never seem to win it.
Correct.
But
They like to moan, which is, it actually reminds me of England initially. had a thing where, unless it was to Australia, they would send understrength teams to West Indies or India, and they would sort of say, "Oh, it doesn't really count because it's not in England," which is why actually when England lose to West Indies in 1950 3-0, that's they kind of can't deny anymore that it's a real defeat because before they would send these slightly weakened team, not even that weakened, but just take one or two players, so they've kind of got their excuse in the bank, and it's almost like England have taken, and it's the kind of the worst sense of English exceptionalism, and it's almost like England have taken this attitude and they've now put it on the World Test Championship, which to me is really important because again we're obviously easy to be Anglo-centric, but to zoom out, you need more countries to have a chance of reaching the pinnacle. You can't say you can only reach the pinnacle of this game if you happen to be born in Australia, England, or India. So the World Test Championship, I think, has been a great innovation. Two of the three winners have been New Zealand and South Africa, so outside the big three countries. But obviously, the format is very, very flawed. But rather than sort of belittle it and say, why do we have this competition? We should be trying to make it better. And that involves a fairer fixture list. And above all, it involves spreading the wealth around more. Cricket ultimately is richer than it's ever been before. It should have plenty in it to have, even if it's just 2 or 3 months a year of Test cricket, which countries can play and be at full strength and not lose players to, T20 franchise leagues and stuff. This is well within the grasp of administrators. But of course, to go back a long way, Leary Constantine and Vinny Mankad, some great players, 30s, 40s, 50s, a series of New Zealand players retired altogether. So they left their countries to play in league cricket because it could earn more money. And
Mm.
again, at the time, that could have been stopped with better administration. So yeah, but the kind of this kind of laissez-faire laxness which has characterized administrators and the kind of inability to really part their own national interests at the door when they're making decisions which should be in the interest of the game. And that's a big frustration. Of course, this is also it also just needs kind of enlightened self-interest. And by that I mean, it's actually in England's interest for West Indies to be stronger and West Indies to come and be a real draw. You get more people watching on TV, you get more people going, you get people paying more buzz around the series, more chance of having a great series which inspires the next generation. It's not actually it's not in it's not in his interest to sort of thrash West Indies, and to thrash them partly because of deliberately sort of, well, not deliberately, but starving them of funds, in a way that's happened, and that's a difference really between say Test cricket and football. So football, if you go to, I'm an Arsenal fan, if I go to Emirates and they beat Man U 6-0, that's great. And I'm not worried about oh, Man U are not strong enough, and that's great. But Test cricket, it needs a contest. It doesn't. It's not exhibition cricket. It's not an exhibition kind of sport. It needs to be good. It needs two strong teams, and that's what you need administrators to work to kind of recognize. And the danger is that we have 12 countries now, and that shrinks to sort of six who play a meaningful amount of Test cricket, which would be a real shame. And that's not an inevitable outcome, but that's a danger of basically more poor administration.
Yes, just a quick anecdote which I'd like you to enlarge on was the story you had about Douglas Jardine and Leary Constantine and Stan Nichols in the 30s. Tell us about that because it did make me chuckle, probably for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, it was funny because obviously we think of Jardine and he's the villain of Bodyline, and that's seen as his sort of his defining thing. But then so the following year, England playing West Indies at home. Leary Constantine is West Indies outstanding player, but he is juggling playing for West Indies, was playing for Nelson in the Lancashire League where he's an absolute hero and he's paid really well. Um, and he plays, one match early in the series, does well, and then he's trying to be released for the final game. And Nelson basically say, "We'll let you go, but only if we can get another player as a professional in your place." And they settle on Stan Nichols, and then John gets wind of this plan, and he picks Stan Nichols for England, basically to stop him playing for Nelson as Constantine's replacement, which has the upshot that Constantine can't play, and it's weakens West Indies. So yeah, of course, it's amusing in some ways, but it does show a sort of pettiness and small-mindedness that kind of does characterize really too much of England's dealings with other countries for much too long. And is a kind of thing that, again, with an ICC, a kind of governing body that's worthy of the name, you could easily prevent that happening by saying, everyone playing a test match will earn a certain amount and everything. So it's a revealing kind of vignette, both about Jordan as a man in terms of his sheer determination to win, however, you know, through whatever means, but also I think of English cricket a bit more broadly.
Yeah, I've got a few more questions for you, but I'm just going to pick one out from the chat. And just to say to everyone who's put a question on there, thank you very much. But I'm going to pick out the one from Jenny Heald, which says, which test series would you have liked to have seen in person?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been asked that a few times. Am I allowed to pick two?
Yeah, go on.
So yeah, the 1902 Ashes is kind of the well, it's the golden summer of the golden age, and the fact you have in consecutive Test matches, you have England's one wicket. Sorry, consecutive Test matches. You have Australia's three-run victory at Old Trafford when Victor Trumper becomes the first ever man to score 100 before lunch on the opening day, which I think still only been done 6 times in history, and that does embody. Well, so it embodies the way he plays. Obviously, one of the most celebrated players of all time, romanticized, but it embodies a kind of leap forward in terms of golden age, in terms of the pitches and scoring more. And it was this interesting equilibrium where it was easier to score than it had been before, but still not that easy. And by that I mean you were still trying to cash in while you could, but you can now play your strokes a bit more rather than what you get in the 30s, which when you can trust the wicket so much you can just bat forever. So you have that in a three-run win for Australia, and then the next test is oval, which is Gilbert Jessop's test really when he scores his 76, although we now think it may be 73 or 74 ball 100, which remains England's fastest ever. England win by one wicket there. So I think that and you have an incredibly high standard of players on both sides. So that would be right up there. The only problem is the test was the wrong way around, and by that I mean because Australia win the first of those, that they have gone 2-0 up and they've regained the Ashes by then, and England win. Well, I guess it's a dead rubber. We now know. Although if you look at the reporting of the game, it's seen as basically equally serious as a normal test. But it is true. It's funny that if you flip them around and then you have Australia winning the Ashes with the 3-1 win in the final game, that would be absolutely perfect. But that would be up there. And then I think I watched 05 and stuff in person, but I think the 1960-61 Australia West Indies series is hard to beat because you have a combination of fantastic, really compelling cricket and wider social political importance. So we talked about the 1950s were a very drab decade. So that's some of the comments of what we're coming out of. We had before the series Don Bradman, who's chairman of Cricket Australia. He talks with Richie Benaud and Frank Worrell about brighter cricket, and of course Frank Worrell is there. So he is the first ever West Indies, the first black captain of West Indies with tenure. So George Headley had done the job once as a one-off kind of celebration of his career in 1948. But Worrell, yeah, his appointment is seen as a grand historic moment, and really really important, and basically merit being embraced in the West Indies team, because before they generally picked a series of white players who weren't as good. So there's this stat I found in the book that until Worrell's appointment, the average for West Indies white players in the top six was 28. The average for everyone else was 43. So they were basically picking weaker players so they could set a certain number of white players. So Worrell's appointment marks the end of that and is really important in the wider moves for independence in the Caribbean. A number of islands then become independent, within a few years. So yeah, those kind of underlying facts, and then you have that coming together. You have the tie test match, the kind of miracle in the first game of that series. And one of the joys of the book was talking to Wes Hall about that last over. It was obviously an 8 ball over as well, but you have that thing at the end where both, because the scoreboard has kind of has folded under the pressure really at the Gabba, and both players from both sides are saying, we think we've won, we think we won, so no one knows what's actually happened. And it kind of can't compute as being a tie, which is a miracle you have 5 days that kind of boil down to this. And then actually the whole series is amazing, and you have it goes down to a 2 wicket win for Australia at the end. And actually in Australia win 2-1, you have you got guys like Benno and Sobers and the 3 Ws, Alan Davison. You have so many fantastic West Hall, you have so many fantastic players on both sides. I think kind of knowing what I do now about neutral umpires and seeing some reporting on that even at the time, I think if West Indies had neutral umpires, they probably would have won that series, because Australia in the fourth test of that series, their last pair batted for over an hour, unbroken to salvage a draw, and there were several seemingly dodgy LBW shouts, and even in the final test, there's some questions. But I think that series just a remarkable combination. The cricket, the politics, and then the miracle of the tie test. So it all kind of coming together, and it marks the start of West Indies becoming the best team in the world for the first time in history. And this is the first time that any team has been the best in the world other than Australia and England. So that's a really important moment for Test cricket. And so there's so many ways that it all comes together. And then I suppose those would be the two. I mean, yeah, 01 I've talked about a bit, but that India Australia series is memorable. Obviously, the 05 Ashes was great as well, which I can remember. I mean, my personal favorite innings, I think, is which again I was privileged to talk to the man about was Brian Lara's 153 at the Kensington Oval 1999 to beat Western Australia by 1 wicket. And it's, yeah, it reminds me of one of one of my Aussie friends said, "Oh, mate, there's a lot of Australia losing in this book in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way," and he's slightly right. And the reason is actually because Australia, to be honest, are so much better than the rest on average. So Australia, they win 1.8 tests for every one that they lose. The next best is 1.25. So they're basically 50% less than 50% better than the competition on average, which means that Australia winning or being very, very good is kind of the default. And often it's actually oddly, therefore, it's Australia losing is kind of the story because news is what you don't expect to happen, not what you do expect to happen, right? And sometimes Australia losing marks the end, marks a kind of turning point. So really, Australia, apart from the 1980s when they went 3 and 32, are, if not the best team in the world, it's basically always true that if you're better than Australia, you will be the best team in the world. That's remarkable. And even you go back to, 1950s is funny because you look at this is seen as a golden age for English Test cricket, and it's true in many ways. When you look at the win-loss record of the overall decade, Australia is still above England. It's not remembered in Australia at all. So it is curious. So Australia, there is a certain phenomenon there, and I talk with guys like Ian Chaplin, Pat Cummins, and try to kind of work out what's happening. It's clearly a kind of combination of factors, from school, state level, from the culture, space, the climate, and a very good kind of pyramid system historically in terms of grade cricket being really tough and competitive and a funnel into state second team even and state, and it's a ruthless period which really tests you, but it finds you out, and it means if you get to playing for Australia, you've gone through so many layers, and I think for a lot of Australians kind of throughout history actually when they've made a test debut, it's often been easier than playing in a really tough Shield game.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? They've certainly had a big part to play in Test cricket, and I've got a question here by Sudhir Junakar, which talks about one of their greatest players, Dennis Lillee, and Sudhir is saying, how important do you think it was of Dennis Lillee setting up a fast bowling academy in Chennai and developing into the development of the fast bowling in India? Very
Yeah, this was
interesting
important.
question.
This is the MRF Pace Foundation is formed, I think, in 1987, and the idea is basically that India are despairing at the lack of fast bowling, and um, so private businessman set it up, Ravi Menon, and the idea is he will get Lilly, and then he to go over give his expertise, and he will kind of headhunt and do talent trials for a series of to try and find fast bowlers, and that also represents an attempt to find them from talent that exists in the whole country. So again, it's looking a bit further afield. It's also what it does. The kind of cultural thing is there where it's showing actually there's a career in India for fast bowlers. We want fast bowlers, and before the message just wasn't there. So when Kapil Dev was 15. He was at under 19 training camp, and he's just given some chapati and beans for lunch, and he's told you can't bowl fast with this. And the selector there kind of laughs and goes, "There's no fast bowlers in India." So it's self perpetuating. I can't logic. We don't produce them, so it's not invested in them. So the arrow helps to lead India away from that. But there's a lot of other factors as well. And one of the um with more money and again, there's more opportunities. India become a bit savvier in terms of their selection. The IPL is actually important as well because it's basically another set of eyes. I talked with Rao Dravid about the difference, why India got so much better from the 90s. He said basically when I was, growing up in late 80s, early 90s in a cricket sense, the only eyes that mattered were your state selectors. And if they didn't think you were good enough, then you would be, that was your path was gone. Now you've still got the state eyes, but you have IPL eyes. You have these state level kind of mini T20 leagues. You also have a series of private academies, which are almost like tennis academies, where you get people. Some people pay. Most people pay to be part of those, but they'll also be looking for people to sponsor to help on to become pros, so they can kind of claim credit for that as well. So basically, you've gone from one set of eyes to four, and that means if you're good enough, it's hard to get missed out, basically. So the kind of rise of merit in Indian cricket is really important. The other thing is you'd get historically a lot of very good Indian players would retire in the early mid 20s from state cricket who weren't quite playing for India because they weren't earning enough. And then for the standard, that was kind of lower standard of domestic cricket. Now with so much more money in it, you can have a really good career without ever playing for India, and that means standard is so much higher. And again, it's that kind of that virtuous circle really.
Yeah, so you interviewed a lot of people. Uh, uh, were they generally all pretty interested in discussing the concept? Because you obviously highlighted some of the best players in the world that are still alive.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, I was really, to be honest, I was blown away by how many people I talked to. It was brilliant. I was trying to I can pick my team of people I interviewed. I think it's something like Langer, Dravid, Williamson, Tendulkar, Peterson, De Villiers, although I want Ian Chaplin there. Guy like Ashwin, Pollock, Murali, Michael Holding, Cummins or Stain. I've talked to so many great people, and I was amazed. But I think it did show me again. This was heartening that kind of how proud players are to be part of a story that's bigger than them. They
Mm.
do see it as bigger than them, and they have a sense that they are part of something much bigger. So that's not to say that players kind of know all the history themselves. Of course they don't, but they do have a sense that they're standing on shoulders of people, and you see this actually all the time because when England go to Australia, actually, this winter, a classic example is that they're not just playing this Australian side now; they are playing the history, and it's why if England win, it'll be the second time they've won in almost 40 years. That's what will make it such a big deal, not just the act of beating this team at the time. And actually, there is this sort of instinctive awareness that players know that something hasn't been done before. A, that makes it harder, and B, that makes it more satisfying if they do it. So that was and that was maybe that wasn't part of my original plans, but actually added so much to the book. But yeah, I think someone like talking to Andy Flower actually was one of the most important because he's very rare in that he's really important in the stories of two different countries of both Zimbabwe. He's obviously their greatest player by a mile, and of England in terms of how they became all in one team in 2011 as when he was coach. So a great, like fantastic interview, but also just an amazing story to be so big and shaping two countries. That's a very rare, very rare thing.
Yes, how interesting it all is. So I'm going to move on to baseball now, and just ask your opinion of that. I think most people would say it's helped Test cricket a lot in this country, but on the flip side, I get a sense that the the selectors, I guess it's the coach, the captain, Rob Key and Luke Wright, are rather dismissive of the structure. You were talking there about Australia having a rigid structure. We've had a very good pyramid that served us very well in the UK for a long time, that allows people to come through from a tiny club, wherever it might be, and end up playing for England. They seem to just randomly pick people and aren't too bothered about the pyramid. But overall, I think people would say it's been an exciting time. Is that your view?
Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, through my kind of historian's lens, I do have a chapter on baseball, and I was trying to put it in context. And I guess there's two parts of that. Is one is what England are doing, is it radical? And the answer is clearly yes, because England is scoring at a run and over more than any team has done in history over such a long period of time. So that in the kind of execution, and the other strand of that is it's radical in its how successful it is, and the answer to that is no, because England have not, they've had three series against Australia and India, for example, and they've not won any so far. But you have to remember that England have won 1 in 17 tests before. So if this is a strategy that takes England from seventh, eighth in the world to number 3 or 4, that's still really successful, even if it doesn't take them to number one. But I guess the obvious comparison would be to really Steve Waugh's Australia side, which is early 2000s, who were both, but what they were doing, they were both scoring quicker than anyone in history, and they were winning more. They won 16 tests in a row. Uh, and then, as a byproduct of those two things together, that led actually to other countries really um, kind of imitating them and a general upward shift in run rates per over. Um, and so that's yeah. So England it is a revolutionary thing, but it's obviously not turned them into the best side in the world. But it doesn't need to have done that to have been successful as a tactic. But I suppose the question is whether it will get England to where they really want to be. Although we have to remember it's incredibly rare, really, how often England are the best team in the world. They've been the best team in the world for basically 12 months since 1959, which is remarkable given the resources England have, the level of interest in cricket, the history. It is remarkable. So you'd have to say England are generally underperforming, but of course, England, since 2000, they've been about twice as good, over twice as good as they were on a kind of win-loss ratio basis than from 1980 till 2000. So that was the kind of dark era. But one of the odd things finding out in the book and realizing, and England 1990s, they're better than 1980s, fairly comfortably actually, which we don't really think about. But we just forget 1980s because England beat up mostly, not always, but mostly beat a very poor Australian side, and that papered over some of the cracks. Whereas 1990s, I think some of us get a really slightly harsh press when actually they are better than the 1980s. And but of course, what happens after 2000s, England, through things like central contracts with which is the most important thing because that is managing bowlers' workloads, through kind of more continuity in team selection, through foreign coaches, Duncan Fletcher and Andy Flower, through two divisions in the championship. They begin to create a system that's kind of more tailor made to producing what's best for England rather than all these kind of interests of the counties all competing against each other. And so England's domestic first class cricket, which we sometimes forget, is comfortably the best sport in the world, which is brilliant. But at times that's sort of been both a blessing and a curse as well. From
Yes, and
through the narrow prism of producing a test team, arguably, of course, the championship has much bigger importance. But on that particular basis, that would be a thing. Whereas New Zealand, for example, actually especially since 2010, that they've had a system that's really, and I talk about this when I explain how they won the World Test Championship, which again, we've been actually a very mediocre team really until 2000 for the bulk of their history, bar the 1980s, and really they've had a system that's all designed around what's best for the national team, to the extent that the coach will call up coaches of domestic teams and say we want this guy batting higher up or whatever, and it's all very kind of New Zealand first, and that has been a reason why they're able to kind of we don't say punch by the way because it's such a cliche now, but why they're able to actually be a very sort of consistent team for a number of years. And then I suppose you talk about West Indies contrast, and one of their problems is with all the different islands that makes that sort of cohesiveness very, very difficult. But West Indies have a chapter on their decline, what's called the parable of West Indies, and really these economic forces have massively hit them. So until 2000, they would get a touring fee. When they toured England, they'd get, it would equate to about a fifth of what England earned from that series. That was replaced by a reciprocal deal, which is where England will go to West Indies for however long West Indies come to England, which sounds great in theory, but because of the different size of the economies, West Indies earn only about 10% as much, 8% as much from hosting England as England earn from hosting West Indies. So of course they're not going to be able to really compete on the field at the end of the day because they're not going to have their best players because they're being handicapped from the start. It doesn't need to be that way, and that's down to poor administration.
I'm going to now ask you about what next, really, because there's two very good questions here, which you can tackle in the wider context. But Mark says, after writing this wonderful book, what would you do, Tim Wigmore, if you were in charge of the ICC for a day, a week, or a month? And then Daniel Crowley also asks a very good question. Says, where do you see Test cricket in 5 to 10 years' time? I know that you've got some good ideas around this, but tell us what you think.
Yeah, so for me, I do keep coming back to this, but I think the Maltese Championship is so important, and that needs to be nurtured and developed, and that we need a number of changes. So for me, it would be to make a simpler fixture list, to make a league table everyone can understand, with everyone playing the same number of games, 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw. This is very controversial, I know, but I think, having looked at the history of Test cricket, the number of days has always evolved. I think we're in a position now where there's a real case for 4-day tests, because I think the sort of honest trade-off, I think, is that when New Zealand plays South Africa or whatever, any really non-Big Three series, I'd rather that was 3 tests times 4 days than 2 or 5, because I think such a part of the magic of Test cricket is actually those those longer series and having this chance to develop, for those narratives to develop. So I'd like to have everyone say playing 18 4-day tests or something over a 2-year cycle, then going into semi-finals and final of the World Test Championship, which means a simple league table. You've got a simple thing to aim for. And that's really good. And the way to, of course, one of the parts of this puzzle is how to fund it, and that entails really the rights, TV rights need to be sold either equal on a kind of collective basis, or you need to have a system like I talked about, which just entrenches that all touring teams get like a fifth of the home team's revenue from that series, and that bankrolls the game. But you need the ICC to take some more central control, and you can get to a position there where you have windows for Test cricket, maybe 3 windows a year of 3 or 4 weeks, where there's no kind of T20 leagues. So you know there's going to be Test cricket in a series of countries. All the best players will be playing because there also should be a proper minimum wage where you can guarantee to earn a certain amount for playing test matches, and that ensures the best players stay actually playing. You have guys like Nicholas Perrin now, who's one of the best T20 players in the world. He's retired from all international cricket now. He's gonna never have played a test match, and it's like he's so talented, and so talent is still being produced by the by smaller countries, but it's not being given. It's the kind of the way the sport is run is preventing that from being on the pitch. But it is interesting that talking to players do actually want to play Test cricket. They're not. I don't believe that's just a platitude, but they also, understandably, because it's a short career, they don't want to play it at the cost of basically losing a lot of money that they could, compared to what they could be earning. Um, so there is interest there. And also I think there's a sort of fundamental there is this narrative of T20 killing Test cricket, whereas for me, I see it as it's all part of the same ecosystem, really. And I see actually, people, lots of Test cricket fans, they don't actually watch that much, in grounds, on TV because of when it's played, but they still, they follow it in ways that kind of economically don't always bring a lot to the format. But I think when people go to a T20 match and they pay £30, they're actually very happy for 3 or 4 quid of that to subsidise basically the test game as well, because they understand it's all part of a bigger landscape. So, just as you have kind of commercial theatre that subsidises Shakespeare or whatever, T20 can subsidise test cricket, but you need administrators to kind of think collectively and see how everything how it all fits together, and just think about that aligned self-interest I keep on talking about. But you need other countries to be strong. You need competition. That's part of Test cricket. If everyone's, if England are beating everyone at home easily, apart from Australia and India, that actually makes things less interesting. So you need administrators to accept that and but find a way, because yeah, the players really do value it, but I think a lot of them feel like they got their hands tied behind their back, and of course, if some countries are playing vastly more than others, that makes it even more difficult. And in terms of ways to Test cricket in 5, 10 years time, so there's sort of firstly, it's not gonna be dead in 5 years. That is just not true at all. And having done this history, I'm unequivocal in saying that. It's arguably been through worse moments than here. We actually, of course, we have more cessation now than we ever have before, which we forget. But the worst case scenario is the game trenches to being played in about 6 countries or so, which would be a real shame. And the best case is we have a vibrant World Test Championship. We have 9 or even more countries playing a lot of Test cricket. Obviously, we have these 3 test stations who are outside the World Test Championship structure now. So that's the other, and that, or somewhere in between those two, and the answer really depends on administrators and be able to, see beyond. But if you're just giving, if you're giving most countries 2 matches and then Australia, India, and England play 5 against each other, that is creating a kind of 2-tier system by another name, and it's going to be very hard for the countries who play less. But I do think, all the things we talked about, all the kind of evolution of Test cricket throughout history. But it's funny that knockout Test cricket is such a new thing. We've only really had 3 global knockout matches ever. We've had the odd, Asia Cup and so on, but that's with the Tri Series. But yeah, three, genuine finals on a global basis ever. The 3 World Test finals, and they've been brilliant spectacles and events. And it does make me think, actually, we could have more of this. We should have semi-finals as well, and that brings another dimension to it. And you can have a kind of World Cup exhibition feel. And those matches, they still have the kind of epic qualities of Test matches, but they have that sense of heightened jeopardy, which I guess over a 5 match series you don't necessarily get that until later in the series.
Yeah. So in short, you're optimistic about the future, but there needs to be some balancing in terms of the financial responsibility for running Test cricket by the ICC.
Yeah, it needs to be a lot. So I'm not like that optimistic, but I'm more optimistic than when I started the project, because A, that was 5 years ago and Test cricket is still around, and B, as I said, nutrition has always been an issue. But also in terms of the product, I mean, the game itself, I think, has maybe never been more exciting than it is now. So the format is the game is really good, and that is very captivating. So if we had I think if we had a situation now where we had a combination of the macro factors and the play on the field was like 1950s, and it would be that would be an absolute existential crisis, because we'd have a a product that was damaged off the field and not compelling on the field. But we have only half those problems. So in that sense, that's a lot better, and it does make me think it's yeah. I do think there's a way, and also the other formats, they kind of need to exist. They kind of need to be shorter than something else, if you know what I mean. And
Mm.
actually, those contrasts, and actually, I think lots of people really enjoy T20, but they want it to be maybe 4 months here. They don't want it to be 12 months here. So that there is yeah. And Test cricket, building that, that England India series, that intensity, the way, everything was factored into 6 weeks actually was kind of amazing. And it is all when people talk about kind of attention. I mean, there is obviously attention spans is kind of an issue, but then we're in an age where people watch these huge sweeping box sets on Netflix, the 20 hours thing, and test series is kind of like that in terms of you have all these different plot arcs and they kind of fit in, and then different characters have their moments and stuff, and it's something also you can dip into in it. And so yeah, in the test series, I don't see it as being yeah, I don't see test cricket as being obsolete or um in terms of as being something that interests people. It's just whether it's given a fair platform and we can see other countries being given a more countries being given a proper chance, because on there's plenty of talent to go around. But you look at South Africa, the World Test champions, they're not playing a home test match this summer, which is a travesty, really.
Mm. No. So I've got one final question for you. The England team for the Ashes has been selected today. Just showing what detailed knowledge I've got of the game. Someone I know came up to me today and said he was Will Jacks's cousin. And I said, well, he's a very good 50 over player and a very good 20 over player for England, but he'll never get a chance in the Test matches. I then look 5 minutes later and he's been selected for the tour. Any thoughts on that, and also on our prospects?
Yeah, so Jazz has been picked as a basically second off spinner. He's kind of batting off spinner. But England are very invested in the idea of off spin being a better bet in Australia than especially left arm spin and even leg spin ultimately. But certainly they were kind of anti left arm spin. Jack Leach had poorly last time, and Liam Dawson kind of underwhelmed them in the test he played this summer. And I mean Nathan Lyon's approach in terms of being tall, high release, bounce. That's what they see Bashir and Jackson being able to kind of emulate that a little bit. Yeah, like we talked earlier what wins test matches. Well, fast bowling wins test matches, and that's especially true in Australia, right? So it depends. The series will be won and lost basically on how England's seam as fast bowlers bowl, and almost really on how fit they can be.
Mm.
If England get say 6 tests combined out of Mark Wood and Jofra Archer, that'll be incredible. But if they get 3, as maybe recent injury history suggests is more likely, then it's very, very difficult. I suppose the history, the history, England have lost 13-0 across the last 3 Ashes series down under. It's very tough. Australia, I think, I think Australia are fairly clear favourites. I think, my prediction at the moment is 3-1 to Australia, and it always rains in Sydney.
Very good. And well, Tim, I think I've taken all the questions off the chat, I think, which we've managed to include. You've given us a terrific hour of entertainment. Thank you very much indeed for that. I think, yeah, good luck with your book. It is a terrific read for anyone that hasn't yet procured it. I can highly recommend it. And it's the sort of book that you'll go back over and over and over again. I think, as you rightly said at the beginning, we've all probably got books about individual series, but actually pulling it all together under one thing takes some doing. So many congratulations on doing that. It's a terrific piece of work, and we'll very much look forward to what you next get up to, which I'm sure that there'll be something coming our way in due course. But
I need a lie down after this, but yeah,
yes.
here it is again. It's lots of great photos as well. So hopefully a lovely Christmas present, either to or for some of the listeners. And yeah, I think it's 500 pages, but yeah, it has a few sort of stats tables and stuff. But yeah, very much is a kind of narrative history.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a very you've done a very nice index as well, which I think people like me thoroughly appreciate. It's might seem a small thing to a lot of people, but I think it's very important if you're, as a reference point when I was checking things, it was very, very helpful. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
on that note, I'm going to thank you very much on behalf of everyone. There's lots of people on the chat saying thank you, great book and great insights, fascinating and insightful. So I think probably I don't want you to leave the room without too many more compliments, but thank you anyway. Much appreciated. And thank you everyone from the Cricket Society and friends for attending tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you again at the next Zoom call.
Thanks so much. I really, really, really enjoyed doing that. Yeah, thank you so much.